Shabbat Shalom. Our parashat for this week is Vayishlach. Vayishlach is Hebrew for "and he sent." And he sent messengers ahead of him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, in the countryside of Edom. At first glance, this parashat seems to be about Yaakov's preparations for and his reunion with his estranged brother Esau. But as we read further, we discover that the central narrative of this parashat is not Yaakov's meeting with his twin, but his second meeting with HaShem. Most people would like for their lives to be blessed by God. Even people who aren't terribly sure that he exists. But in order to experience his blessings, we must commune with him. We must have a relationship with him. Whatever blessing or guidance you might desire at this moment, meeting with God always comes first, as we see so clearly through the experience of our father Yaakov. Yaakov returned home after a 20-year absence. Now, I've lived in the UK for nearly 35 years, but during that time, I have returned to the United States on numerous occasions. I haven't been there for a while, but I returned when my parents were still living. I returned regularly to see them. But Yaakov was gone for 20 years. The question is, can one really return home after a 20-year absence? Famously, author Thomas Wolfe wrote, "You can't go home again." And what he meant was that attempts to relive youthful memories or experiences are never really as fulfilling as our remembrance of them. People attempt to go back to places they've been, maybe as a child growing up, and find them changed. But you know, it's not just the place that changes, it's you. Yaakov's return found his parents dead. Whatever grief and desolation he might have felt, he had no one with whom to really share it. Having left the family home 20 years earlier with nothing, he returned with 2 wives, 2 concubines, many children, servants, flocks, and herds. He was a man of wealth and substance. Having left the land of promise at the age of 40, he took nothing with him. Everything of value in his life up to that time remained behind. At 60 plus, Yaakov was a man of wealth, a man of substance. He returned from 20 years outside the land with all that most men could possibly want. He was now a man to be held in respect and honor, but he was also a man with responsibilities. He was the head of a tribe. And when he had last seen his brother Esau, his twin hated and wanted to kill him. Yaakov returned with a certain amount of trepidation, wondering if Esau had changed. But this was not merely the encounter of two estranged brothers. It was really the meeting of two tribal leaders. God had kept his promises to Yaakov at Bethel when he left the land those 20 years ago to sojourn outside of Canaan. God had seen him through every difficulty and struggle that he had faced during that time. In brief, to recap, his father-in-law had duplicitously engineered his marriage to Leah, which he had accepted in order to be able to have Rachel, whom he truly loved. He was forced to work 14 years for no set wages as payment for his brides, one of whom he didn't want. Lavan, his father-in-law, also his uncle, tried to secure his further work for free, but God provided substantially and miraculously for him. Yaakov overcame, and he prospered abundantly, and he knew that God was with him. In spite of Yaakov's father-in-law, God had given him success in material terms, and now God had told him to return to the land of his birth. He was to go back, and this was the land that had been promised to him, to his father, to his grandfather. Yaakov, at this point, had done everything humanly possible to prepare the way for his return and the rather doubtful reunion with his twin brother. He had sent a series of rather substantial gifts to his brother, hoping that these might appease Esau's resentment if he was still angry, who knew. But more importantly, that these gifts would demonstrate that Yaakov needed and wanted nothing from Esau. He did not remind his brother that despite the disposition of the birthright, the family fortune had gone solely to Esau. He addressed Esau through his servants in a manner which was calculated to placate his brother in its humility, referring to him as my Lord. He did not remind his brother that despite the past, he did not want anything. And he demonstrated that he had no intention of forcing the issue of the birthright or of his inheritance. He had prepared for the meeting with Esau by assisting his wives and his children to cross the river, ready for the next day's journey. By allowing them to precede him, he is again stating that his desire is for peace and for the past to remain in the past. His family, in a sense, is a kind of security, ensuring his good intentions. Now, it's an interesting fact that among the tribes of South Africa, and some of you may have read about this. I actually knew members of the Saint family. You might remember Nate Saint, the Saint party that went to share the good news with Indians of South America, tribes who'd never seen people from outside before, and they felt that it would be wise to leave their wives behind. Their wives had come with them to South America, but they felt that it would be wise to leave them behind. And as a result, they went in, only men, and it was assumed by that fact that they had come to harm these people, and therefore they were killed. I can remember that as a child, hearing about this from my parents. If they had taken their wives, the likelihood is that they wouldn't have been harmed, because then it would have been understood that they came in peace. So local knowledge is really important sometimes. But this is exactly what Yaakov was doing by putting his family in front of him. He was sharing with Esau the fact that he didn't want any trouble. Yaakov could now look back over more than 20 years and remember his first experience of God's presence and God's promises directly to him at Bethel. Returning to Canaan, he had been met by messengers of the Lord, Malachim, who reassured him that the God who had been ever present continued to protect him and his family. Maha'anim means two hosts, so two individuals, but obviously angelic. He turned his thoughts to prayer. He used the time to prepare himself in prayer. He was a man of prayer, a man who knew how to pray. His prayers reminded God of the promises that God had made to him and of God's mercy and blessings upon Yaakov's life up to this point. Despite all of these very appropriate preparations, Yaakov did not feel ready to face his brother. Can you imagine for a moment being in his position? Many issues were unresolved in his own mind. He faced the future with trepidation and uncertainty. He and his wives had chosen to leave the home of Laban, his wives feeling that they had been cheated of their inheritance in the way their husband was treated and had been given no dowry at all. But he might have questioned his decision to return to Canaan. Is this really his home? Should he be here? Should he have tried to make a life for himself and his family somewhere else? Yet surely this was the land promised to his family forever by the one eternal God and promised to him. And we read then that Yaakov was left alone. Although all of these people had come with him in flocks and herds and servants, it was as it had been at Bethel 20 years earlier. He was once again left with a sense of isolation, as an alien in a strange land. His thoughts perhaps in chaos. This was yet another turning point, a crossroads in Yaakov's life. Yes, he had experienced God's presence and God's protection in his life in the past, and he knew that God was with him. But he sensed that something was missing. He was not at peace about the future. So very early in the morning, really still night, Yaakov arose to renew his prayers. Again, I have to say this is a man who knew how to pray. And he prayed until he received the answer from God. This is what some people call praying through. It means continuing to pray, continuing to speak to God and listen for him to speak to you until you know that you have an answer. In answer to his prayers before day broke, a messenger came from God to meet with Yaakov. This malach, usually translated into English as angel, was much more. But malach really means messenger. And he had the appearance of a man, but he was unique. The promises that he gave to Yaakov are given not as one who speaks for another, as an angel or a messenger of any kind might speak for God, but as an independent agent makes promises. The only one who can make such promises is God himself, and thus we know that this was a theophany, an appearance of God to Yaakov. God himself came to test Yaakov's resolve and his endurance, and to try him not only physically but spiritually. And this trial took hours, but it may have seemed to Yaakov much longer. In Hosea, we're told that Yaakov, by his strength, had power with God. But we're not talking here about physical strength. We're told that he wept and made supplication. He had power and prevailed. Despite the length of the struggle, Yaakov's faith was not shaken, and his prayer was not silenced. Yaakov held his ground, not by his own strength, but by empowerment from the God who had come to test and prove him. This being at last requested that Yaakov release him. Well, he was perfectly able to release himself. But God had set this as yet another test to prove Yaakov's endurance, his commitment, and his persistence, his perseverance. The entire trial was not, of course, for God's benefit, but for Yaakov's. God already knew Yaakov's heart and his righteous resolve. But Yaakov needed to know the strength of his own conviction and to receive assurance that God was truly with him. Why was Yaakov tested? Why was Abraham tested? The answer comes to us in the book of the other Yaakov. In chapter 1, verse 3, the testing of your faith produces perseverance. This was a further maturing experience to advance one who already walked with God. Yaakov persisted, resolving not to lose the advantage of his victory. He had wrestled with God's messenger for much of the night, and he knew he must hold on and hold out to receive the blessing. In his request for a blessing, he makes it clear that although he may have been allowed the upper hand in this struggle, he is the inferior. The greater always blesses the lesser. Despite the fact that he prevailed, Yaakov expressed humility and total submission to the one with whom he had struggled. And so Yaakov became Yisrael, although he continued to be Yaakov, the one who had taken hold of the promise and the birthright, a name given by his parents. He would be known as the one who inherited from his father and his grandfather by right and by God's purpose. He would be remembered as the one who had received honor directly from God, and not merely because he was the son of Yitzchak and the grandson of Avraham, to whom God's covenant had been given. Now he is also Yisrael, a name he earned by his perseverance. Isn't it interesting that he was Yaakov all during his time outside the land, and that God did not give him this new name at Bet El at the time when he left? He is now a prince with God, one who has standing with God, who can come to God with authority, having demonstrated his endurance and commitment. He has given a name greater than those of the great men of the earth. He is not a prince among men. He is a prince with God. Having power with God, Israel will prevail with men, even with his brother Esau, and with all who come against him in the years ahead. And since we know the end of his story, we know that he needed all that God had given him to deal with the difficulties of his life, the early loss of Rachel and Yosef, the restoration of Yosef, and the move to Egypt in his old age. We also read of Israel's infirmity. For the remainder of his life, Israel would be reminded by a slight limp that he had struggled with God and prevailed. He had gained favor with God, who was now no longer the God of Avraham and Yitzchak, but would now be known as the God of Israel. He did not look upon his infirmity as a reproach any more than Rav Shaul did his thorn in the flesh. As with the place where he first met with God, which he had named Beit El, house of God, he honored this place with a name. Israel did not name the place for his victory or to proclaim his valor. He did not praise himself. Instead, the name that he chose for this place, like the name he had chosen years earlier at Beit El, offers praise to God for his goodness and mercy. He called it Peniel. Here I met with God face to face. Those whom God honors are enabled to humble themselves and appreciate the greatness of his chesed, his loving kindness to them. As he passed the place where he had just met with God, the sun rose. He greeted a new day with assurance of God's grace, mercy, and blessing on his life, his future, and that of his family, and a new name. Perhaps you are waiting for an experience like that of our father Yaakov. But in doing so, you may miss the meeting with God that He has ordained for you. It may not be the same sort of experience at all, or it might. But at some time and in some way, each of us must seek the face of God, desiring, even hungering to meet with Him in a way which we have not met with Him before. I'm not talking about a salvation experience, as when you chose to accept the atoning work of Yeshua and be reconciled with God. You may have walked with God after a fashion for a period of time, maybe even for many years, as of course did Yaakov. But then a crossroads may be reached, even a crisis point, where you acknowledge the uncertainty and trepidation that comes when no human agency can provide what is needed. This is the time to look to God so that He might take you forward to the next step in your relationship with Him. When you cry out to Him and seek Him in prayer, God will meet with you face to face. Perhaps He will not take human form to test your faith as He did with Yaakov, but He will speak to you in a special way. The Ruach HaElohim will help you in your weakness as you pour out your heart to God in supplication, seeking His peace and guidance. In your intense earnestness, you may struggle to find the words to say or the thoughts with which to even form these words. This kind of prayer is indeed a kind of wrestling with God. In times of trial and struggle, it is the same kind of perseverance shown by Yaakov that God seeks to find in each of us. No matter how discouraged or exhausted you may be, you will prevail with God because He has promised that His strength is sufficient for all your needs if you are resolved to persist and not give up. At these crisis points in our lives, we too are required to demonstrate our commitment, persistence, and endurance, our will to go on until the blessing is received. God knows your heart, but He tries you so that you will be stretched, so that you will learn to rely upon Him for strength and come to understand His heart for you, so that you might become a man or woman of strong and determined character. Don't allow the blessing that God has for you to be subsumed by your frailty and weakness. Prevail with God through humility and submission, resolving to accept no denial, but to pursue blessing until blessing is received. Fervent prayer, God tells us, is effective prayer. Don't be afraid to pray with all the strength that you have. We are told that weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. That sounds so much like Yaakov's experience. When God seeks to transform you, that experience is often accompanied by deep struggle, as with Yaakov. There may even be physical signs that such a struggle has taken place. God desires, He plans that each of us will be transformed from one who thinks of success only in human terms into a man or woman who knows spiritual success. Like Yaakov, you can become someone who has power with God, who prevails in prayer, who gains the victory and the blessing. For such a metamorphosis to take place, you must be an active participant, not a bystander, not an observer. As Yaakov had to become not merely the son and grandson of those whom God had made his covenant with, but the true covenant holder with a direct link, a personal relationship with God. You can be transformed, as Yaakov was transformed, to one who has true standing with God if you follow Rav Shaul's advice. Do not let yourselves be conformed to the standards of the Olam Hazeh, this world. Instead, keep allowing yourselves to be transformed by the renewing of your minds so that you will know what God wants, and you will agree that what He wants is good, satisfying, and able to succeed. Our father Yisrael discovered what God wanted in his life, and he agreed with God that his path was best, that it was good and satisfying. As he had already rejected the world of the Canaanites when he left for Haran, he now rejected the standards and materialism of his father-in-law, putting Haran behind him. As he sought restoration to the land of promise, he was transformed, his mind renewed by his encounter with HaShem. May this be your experience too. God bless you on this Shabbat and through the week ahead.